So I think you thought I ignored you, right or wrong?
Right. I wasn't sure exactly what you were doing or what I was getting into when I messaged you. Yeah, and then we kind of just
Didn't you
ran.
email me and then like I didn't respond and you just thought I was big dogging you, but I don't think I got the email or something. Or you didn't send it, something like that.
Yeah, it's hard to remember now, but I just remember watched one of your videos on YouTube. It was one of the McDavid, how to skate like McDavid videos. And, I was looking at the stuff you were teaching and like what you were explaining. And, at this point, I was working in the AHL in Hartford, and they send an NHL
No
skills
big
coach.
deal.
They send an NHL skills coach down. He does, all these drills, and, you go over video together. But what was crazy is like what you were teaching and what your videos were showing were completely different than anything I had heard before or anything I had seen or anything in like, the realm of the pro hockey world.
And what was that specifically?
I think, I don't know, it's funny now watching, that like I've been involved with Train 2.0 for, a number of years now. And I think it was just a lot of the traditional power skating coaching cues and, the other things that were being taught that, I think it's so much different now with, what you've been able to prove and show through Train 2.0. So, it was a completely different way of looking at mechanics and, I guess studying these top NHLers or the top players.
So we got started here and jumped right into the start of mine and Sean's relationship. And um, Sean, why don't you reintroduce yourself to folks?
Yeah,
Or
so
do you want me to
Jason,
do that? Sean doesn't like talking about himself.
no, it's okay. I found Train 2.0 when I was 31. I think I was playing in Hartford in the AHL at this time. And, I found Jason. Like I said, I saw one of your McDavid videos of how to skate like McDavid. And, I watched other videos and I realized, like, okay, this guy is really knows his stuff. He has something here. It's different. So at this point, I wasn't exactly sure, but, I took the leap and sent you a message, asked if we could work together, and when the hockey season finished up, headed out to Vancouver for a month, and we were able to start working together.
Yeah, that was fun. And you're originally from which town?
Cole Harbour, Nova Scotia. A couple pretty good hockey players come out of
Huh.
there, and Nathan McKinnon and Sidney Crosby. Pretty lucky, pretty fortunate to be from that hometown, and get to get out in the summers with them, get on the ice.
And you had a cool progression. So you went U Sports, CIS at the time, um, and to the coast to the AHL, correct?
Yeah, that was it. So I started, would have been junior A. I got cut from the QMJHL when I was, I played half a season at 19 because, in my hometown, Halifax Mooseheads, they had a pretty good team and they loaded up at the trade deadline. So I went back to junior A for 19 and 20. And lucky for me, my junior A coach, he had a pretty good relationship with the head coach of the St. Mary's Huskies and Trevor Steinberg. Steiny agreed to take me to SMU as kind of that 13th forward practice player. Yeah, and I was able to spend 4 good years at St. Mary's before heading into the pro ranks.
Yeah, and you kind of like your MO was like super talented, not a lot of effort, right? And you just kind of got cruised by on talent, right? Was that kind of your
Yeah, it was my skating, definitely my my nice skating stride, and yeah, a lot of the mechanics, which it was so unknown back then. We're going back 15 years now, with minimal adjacent. Like you're probably one of the first people to really start putting your information out on YouTube, but really not a whole lot was known back then. And it was going through traditional power skating, doing the hockey camps and things like that of that nature. It's definitely not how it is now with, the knowledge and the focus on mechanics and, everything else that comes along with being a pro hockey player in today's game.
did tease it earlier, but you did grow up around some really big hockey names in Sidney Crosby, Nate McKinnon, Brad Marchand, and then there's more and more. How did being around those guys inspire you?
Yeah, I think it's crazy to see, the level that they live their lives on in terms of the standards that they set for themselves. I mean, if you take somebody like Sid and you see him in the summer and his hands are all blistered because he's, been out working on his shot, shooting so many pucks in his backyard that he's got to tape his hands up when he comes to skate. Take Nate, 100-point season, still not satisfied, continues to push, on every direction. Now he's putting up monstrous years, winning the hard, and let's see what happens this year. But again, he continues to push the envelope of development in the sport. And then somebody like Brad, it's amazing, right? He's a third round pick that, first 20 games in the NHL, I think he had 1 assist. He wasn't supposed to be in the NHL. And then, somebody like that, he simply outworked everybody else to make the NHL. It was, I was somebody who got to see firsthand how hard he worked and his determination in the sport to not be denied. And, that conviction is, the reason he is the person and player he is today.
Yeah, well, I think what you said well is like when you're around people that have higher standards, it totally lifts your standards. And I grew up on the West Coast, and and one of the things that was just fascinating to me was when I met you was the East Coast versus West Coast mentality, which is here, it's kind of like everyone's chill vibes. It's like, how good can you be without really trying that hard? That's maybe changed a little bit. Whereas, and it probably has changed also in hockey culture overall. But when you mentioned to me that like your group chat or whatever, like people are roasting each other for like not putting in the effort or like not showing up and not going the extra mile. And it's like it was growing up for me, it was like inverse. It's like if you went the extra mile, it was like, what's that lunatic doing? Whereas for you, it sounds like the group actually set the norm as going the extra mile. And if you weren't, that was weird. What was that like? Or am I wrong in that?
No, look at what Sid has brought to the sport. I think he's such a great role model. If from you hear any story or anybody that, that's been in Pittsburgh or has spent time around the guy knows just he works harder than anyone. And, this is coming from the best player in, our generation. And, it's really remarkable to see that, these guys can't be satisfied. There's no off button. And, it's so inspiring to see even heading to the World Cup now. And, Nate's going with them. And it's just that continual push to be the best. It's so inspiring for, I think, every hockey player. And, it's great for the sport.
Yeah. Now we talk about inspiration, but what about frustration? Like, I think you might have identified with me on the idea of, being around those people, putting in the work. Like, would you say, like, when you look back on your kind of time developing, would you say that you skimped on effort at all?
No, definitely. And this is what's kind of funny is I feel like everybody in the hockey world or, a strong majority think they're working hard, but you can see kind of the different standards of that hockey players carry. And I've been fortunate enough to see just how hard some of these top players in the world work on a daily basis. And, I think that's, at some point in time, which you've identified with Train 2.0, there really is a lot more that goes into the game of hockey than just hard work. And, I think you've done a tremendous job outlining that for sure. It's a staple and, there's no way around that, nor
Well,
should there be.
do you think a lot of hockey players are delusional about the amount of work that they put in? Like, I have found that like once players get to a certain age, and I would say it's usually around like maybe 16, 17, they start to kind of become pretty realistic about the will. Like they kind of have that Nick Kyrgios thing where they're like one of the most honest interviews I've ever seen in sport, where he's like, Nadal and Federer and Djokovic, like they want to be on the court 5 hours, 6 hours a day. I don't want to do that. That's why they'll be world champions and I'm not. And like he makes a lot of money from the sport and he's going to do well. He's talented at it, but he's honest about that. And I do find that like when you get to the nuts and bolts of it, there are like, I find most players are pretty accurate about like the level of effort they're willing to put in. But do you see that differently?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Like when you go to say training camp every year and you talk to everybody worked out in the summer, everybody worked hard, but there's varying degrees. And I think I've been lucky to see the level that some of these guys have been able to push themselves to. And there's just there's there's definitely levels to it. And I would 100% say that everybody or the vast majority think they're working hard, and it's nowhere
So do you
near.
think they're delusional?
And I don't know if they're delusional, Jason. I think there's different levels to it, and that I would leave it at that.
Well, I think that's maybe where we differ, because like I agree everyone thinks they're working hard, but I think that not everyone, say the professional level, knows that they are actually putting in the full effort. Like, and I'll just give an example, which is like when I went to KHL training camp, like there was a good chunk of players that like they knew they were putting in world-class effort and they were putting in world-class effort. And then there's also a good chunk of players that like knew they were very good and didn't need to put in the world-class effort. And They showed up to camp and were like not in shape. They use camp to get in shape, and that's fine in Europe, right? But they just knew that and they had the confidence in it, and maybe they had big long careers, and I mean they're a million times better than me. So I mean I had to show up in great shape, but they didn't, and I think like they kind of knew that and had the confidence in their ability to adapt and improve. I don't know, I feel that a lot of players are honest in that way once they get to a certain age. I would say though at a younger level, players definitely protect themselves and kind of just try to say, oh, yeah, like, I did work super hard, when that honesty is often missing with themselves. But I think at the older levels, players are pretty honest with themselves.
So yeah, no doubt. I would say then, so I think we can both agree in pro hockey, not working hard is really not a non-negotiable,
No,
especially
absolutely.
in today's game. So what would you add then aside from like, you get your gym sessions and like you have to make sure you're fit and obviously watching your diet, but like I know primarily Train 2.0 focuses on mechanics, but what role would you say that plays now in player development, and where do you see that going here in the future's game, and like yeah, especially today's game?
Well, I think that's the willingness to lead and think different, because I think you touched on it. It's like you and I hope no one miscategorizes what I'm saying, like that people aren't working hard. Like obviously you have to work hard, you have to skate, you have to lift, you have to do all those things. But I think what you talk about with Marchand and McKinnon and Sid is they go the extra mile. And one of my favorite sayings, I heard it when I was like 12, was like there's no traffic jams on the extra mile. And because like there's no one doing that. But like it's not just like, oh, did I do an extra 5 push-ups? If we were supposed to do 50 push-ups and I did 55, that's not the extra mile. The extra mile is, I mean, it does show a mindset, but the extra mile is like willing to think different and like try something new and try something different. I had a really interesting conversation on this podcast actually with a guy who did player development, and his whole thing was like tactics, like use tactics, 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 tactics. And he shared with me that the team he was working with, I think they had, I don't know, 40 players. And of the 40 players, they designed like a development plan for them. And this is across the AHL and NHL. And he said, of all those players, none of them achieved their development goals, and from like a tactical perspective. And I thought that was very interesting because first off, I was like, well, what's the point of doing that then? And second, I thought, that's really more a symptom of the environment and the culture. And I'm not talking of that specific team. I'm talking writ large in hockey and professional hockey, which is that you're in this very awkward thing where you need to develop, but not make mistakes. And by nature, if you're going to develop, you have to get out of your comfort zone and make those mistakes and try things that you're uncomfortable with and try things that are different, primarily mechanics, right? My belief is that your mechanics is going to unlock your ability to do tactics. Now, if you are just like not tactically thinking, well, then that's an issue. Like you just can't like process that, or someone teaches it to you and you choose not to follow it, then like that's fine. But my findings so far is that when you teach someone the mechanics of, let's say, the outside edge, something McDavid is really good at, and players that previously didn't feel comfortable like leaning to gather speed, and you teach them to do that, all of a sudden new movement options open up. When the new movement options open up, then you can teach tactics. But so many players are limited by their mechanics. And because they're limited by their mechanics, and then also they're in a zero failure environment because they have to perform every day, they don't get better. So what I really think is the players that are developing are the ones that are willing to, and it doesn't have to be in season, it could be off season, try new things, think differently, go not just want to copy what everyone else is doing, but actually like think for themselves and unlock what could be their full potential. So that's where I feel that the mechanics fits in. And I think you identify that well. What are you like? And then I think probably the players that you're around do that too. But you tell me if I'm wrong on that.
As somebody who's been applying, working on their mechanics and kind of that never-ending path to mastery and trying to always improve, I think it's proven that, and I'm sure you can say the same thing to this too. When you go to the gym and you get a nice, pump on, you do a muscle group and you can really feel that change. And I think that dopamine spike that you get from knowing that, your training is occurring, or it's so much easier to measure, as opposed to when you go working on your mechanics and you're working on your corkscrew or your soft drag, you can't measure it in the same way that you can of looking at watching the weight in your bench press go up or how many pull-ups you can do. And I think that might be a reason why mechanics isn't so dominant in the sport yet for training. I
Oh
mean,
my God. Absolutely. I
right?
think we were
Somebody,
having this talk about relationships, which is like when like people focus on, for example, we'll take it to money and psychology for a second, and then we'll go back to training, which is like in when couples or people fight about money, you like fight about budgets or like the money because it's like easy to measure and easy to see. Whereas how you feel about spending money, for example, is not something that is like much discussed because you can't measure that. It's much harder to measure. So when you're training for hockey, it's like I just did a run. I just did a half marathon. No big deal. But, I like saw my time and like I'm like, oh, that's my time, and like I can go faster, and it's so easy for me to measure. But when I'm working on my outside edge, it's like it's much harder to measure how I'm doing with that. So it doesn't provide that immediate dopamine hit. And so in hockey, when your beep test score went up or your bench press went up, so much easier to measure. When you see, did my shin angle improve? Yes, you can measure it, and we show you how, but most people don't do that. It's not the first thing they look at is how do I improve my shin angle? It's just harder to measure. So therefore people they're not gonna go and try to measure. They're not gonna measure their progress against that. And that's okay, but that is the advantage that a lot of hockey players can exploit.
yeah, no doubt. And that's funny too, is you can't really like you don't know how many reps it's going to take of doing the anchor in the summer for it to show up automatically in a game, right? And that's another part too, is a bit of the unknown. And I think there was that case for working with, working on mechanics and bringing that to the sport. But what do you think, or like where do you see things going with, first off, with like you identify trends rather well? What do you see coming for hockey development, and specifically maybe with what you've seen through Train 2.0, coming in the coming years? Or what do you think that's going to look like in the sport compared to say tennis or golf or some of these more technical sports?
Trends, I mean, I've already seen it happening, and which is and what unlocked Train 2.02 was the smartphone and the ability to film things. And that is going to lead to a whole revolution in skill development. It already has. You can see it with people at the rink. People will film themselves naturally. Parents love filming their kids. What's that software thing? Rink something that,
Oh,
that
live.
films automatically. Live Barn, yeah. So like that's there. People love that. So those are all things that, didn't exist before. And the big unlock, and I was just really fortunate timing, that I was going through kinesiology and studying movement quality. So I don't know if you've ever heard this story, but basically I volunteered as an intern in our gym while I was in kinesiology. And I was doing movement analyses of these 6 movements. And it was incredible. It was so boring, but I loved every second of it. What we did was we did these 6 movements, and in the 6 movements, I had this big checklist of every movement deficiency that was happening in that movement. Like literally every deficiency that could possibly exist in their movement. And so it would be like valgus knee alignment, varus knee alignment, pronation, supination, kyphosis, lordosis, all the different things that could happen in a joint. And fortunately at the time, everyone was down in their like shorts and like they had to be skin tight shorts and no t-shirt, nothing while they were doing these movements. And so I would have to score each person's movement on that. And that's how I learned how people move. But this was just around the time smartphones were getting good. And before that, it was this huge affair to try to film anyone or anything. You had to like get your crappy digital camera out, put like a card in it, and then like stick it into your computer. Your computer would crash. It would run out of memory because there's no memory. It was just everything was bad. But what started to happen around the time when I was doing that movement analysis was I was actually starting, like, the software was getting good. You could film, easily drag and drop, and then analyze it and put it next to another person. And I was seeing this, and I was like, I wonder if I could like do the same thing with hockey. Like, there's all these things. The Sedins were big at the time, and they're still big. They crushed like a 38-minute or something 10K the other day in the local Vancouver run, so they're still crushing it. I love it. That's the mindset extra mile thing we talk about. But there is these things they did to protect the puck which I just couldn't understand. I I just didn't get it. And no one had showed that to me. And you had to have some of those things, right? Like, what are some things where you just like looking at things and you're like, what is going on?
I think the biggest one was the first time, I think that we were looking at a video of my crossovers and we were looking at the difference between how I cross over and how Nate crosses over. And you were pointing out how I was so focused on the outside leg and I was basically primarily pushing off that leg. And the difference of, how Nate crosses over primarily focused on his inside leg.
Yeah.
And, that was something that I was like, I had never seen or even thought about in the sport. And like you said, now this is, back, what would that be, 7 or 8 years ago now, but it just wasn't so mainstream like it's being talked about now in the various, hockey development, channels. So
Yeah.
that really, my line is, being on the ice with him, but like never actually seeing these kind of details and like, having starting points in different places to, really start working on like details of mechanics.
Yeah, and I guess what, I don't know, is my either superpower or curse is that when I like see a movement that I don't understand, I need to understand it. And the Sedins would do this thing all the time when they'd enter the zone and they'd come in wide in a corkscrew and then they'd roll onto their outside edge and then they would usually get wide again and like anchor or like do a punch step. At the time, I had no language for that. There was no language, and it wasn't just Jason that had no language for it. That language did not exist. They would just wiggle their bodies into the zone and somehow maintain control of the puck. That's what happened. Like on a nightly basis, I would watch it in Vancouver. And then even better during that time, well, not for the players, but for me, was they had the NHL lockout and they needed a place to skate. So the Sedins and Bieksa and we had Kessler out at one point. So all these and they were in their prime. They came and skated with us at UBC. And that was just my dream. I was like watching everything they were doing and asking questions. And they were so nice, so professional, and so willing to just share advice. And I learned so much from them during that very short time.
Yep.
And what's that?
Sorry, I was just going to say, how does that impact? So you talk about, the Sedins coming in a corkscrew and then rolling on their outside edge and making a play. But like, I think what, a lot of people maybe new to this side of the game wouldn't understand is what is different about moving that way than, or how does that give a mechanical advantage versus, another player's zone entry and, how they would try and make a play?
Well, yeah, so I mean and I'll like perfectly contrast myself to them, which is I had like two modes when I skated, which was like or maybe four, which was I could skate in a straight line, I could do crossovers, and that was about it, I guess. Like I was also pretty good at skating backwards, and like pivoting and that stuff. But I didn't if I did do these things like anchors, punches, soft drags, outside edge rolls, 10 and 2s, it was by accident and not because it was at all like natural to me. And so I was a very good, like in those movements, I was a very strong, very good player in those movements. And also like I was very strong and very good shape. Those were the measurable things I could measure. And I gamed that metric. Like if there was a thing to measure, which was VO and beep test score, I won the beep test score, like top 1-2 on my team. There was bench press and power clean or whatever. I would always be top in that because it was easy to measure. But what I realized was that there was literally movements, going back to it, that the Sedins would do as they'd enter a zone that I just, not only did I not know how to do, I just didn't understand. Like I just could not wrap my brain around it. So that's what got me thinking about, well, can I use this movement analysis that I did way in the gym to start to break down what is happening with their movement? And that's what I did, which was I started to realize, okay, the hips are going to, let's take the corkscrew. They're going to be abducted. Now I'm going to use all this technical language, but this is how I broke it down. So they're going to be abducted. They're actually slightly internally rotated at the hip. Knees are flexed. And then what they're going to do is they're going to rotate their hips. So let's say they're rotating to the right. Their hips are going to rotate to the right. They're going to take their back leg actually into interior rotation, their front leg into exterior, and they're going to roll onto their outside edge. So they're going to actually like supinate that front foot, that leading foot. And so I broke it down that way. And then once I broke it down, what I realized was I needed to then like give it language to then be able to like teach it to myself. So I could do one rep and then another. And that was how I took the movement analysis of UBC that I was doing there, and then applied it to hockey, and then with the benefit of those guys, like watching them every day, and I could just see that there was these movements. And so what this like led me to, because then the NHL went off a strike and they went back into the season, just would what I would do was I would watch NHL games, and I would wait till a movement happened where I didn't know what it was and I didn't think I could do it, and just these subtle movements. Like, I'm not talking like these like crazy breakaway things, but like I was a D-man, so controlling the puck effortlessly and smoothly is very important. So what I would do is I would look carefully, and I would see, like, it'd be like maybe like Chris Tanev at the time, and I'd see him pick up a puck a certain way and make a movement and do this, or like Bieksa. And I'd clip that footage and I would say, what is this movement? I would break down piece by piece what the movement was. Then I would write down what I thought the movement was. Then I would go film myself do that movement. Slowly, I started to build myself this library of movements that I was not able to do before. They were actually foreign, different movements that I'd never been taught. And I taught myself each of those movements step by step. And then once I would get comfortable with the movement, then I'd move on, right? I was like, okay, I can hit the outside edge. I can do a 10-2 pivot. I can punch this way and do this. That's how I built myself up after watching these players that I just didn't understand. And then applying the research internship thing I did at UBC. So that's how that whole thing unfolded.
No, that's cool. And then, I think it's funny you always kind of reference this stuff as the magic behind the mechanics. And to peel back the layers to a situation like being able to break down exactly what's happening, like that's great. And like you said, these top players, they're world class at what they do. And I think that's great that, with what you provided at Train 2.0 was giving a way to start training these mechanics in. And maybe you could only do a move like the Sedin, say 10, 20, 30%, but that gives you something that you can slowly build up towards. So where you can, copy, quote unquote copy, right? You had a good quote about copying. What was it exactly? The greats, or we copy the greats to, look at how Kobe Bryant went about copying Michael Jordan,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah. Well, that's how every great player learns and develops, is they look at what the best is doing, and then they aim to emulate it, and then they aim to add their own flair to it. I think that's kind of, when you watch Nate McKinnon and Sidney Crosby, they have different builds, but one is, I guess they're 8 years apart. And they are, like, if you actually look at their movements, they're quite similar in their mechanics, but they just have different body proportions. So one is definitely emulating the other, and learning from and expanding. And then, I think there's a good symbiosis there, but that's the, like copying those movements was a really critical thing. But one of the things I talk about was the 0 to 1 moment. So once you get on, like, as soon as I can do like a punch turn 30% as good as Henrik and Daniel, I'm going to get to 100% soon with enough reps. But it's actually crossing that threshold from not knowing the movement at all to to being able to do it at all. I call it 0 to 1, going from not being able to do a punch step, for example, to doing a punch step at all, is that big thing. And most players never cross that threshold. They never go from 0 to 1. They never know how to do a punch turn. They never know how to do a soft jake. They never know how to do you fill in the blank. But once they do, they can feel their way there, because they'll know, as long as they do the reps, they'll get themselves there. So that's what I was unlocking for myself was, and if you saw me move today at 34 and you saw me move at 22, you'd be like, there's a total difference. You wouldn't even see the same player. And that's just because I took a bunch of movements and I went from 0 to 1 in movements that I could not do or comprehend. And now I'm getting the reps on them. So that's a big thing.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I think it's, in the sport of hockey, 22, you're supposed to be right on the cusp of, entering hockey prime in the next couple of years. And physically, you're supposed to be maxing out, as opposed to your age, 34, or somebody in my shoes here at 36. You're not supposed to be necessarily improving on your game, because, as Father Time catches up with everybody, it's kind of the trade-off, right? So that's interesting that you say, as an older player, I really like hearing and, understanding that, there's lots of room for improvement even as you get older, and, kind of staying on that path to mastery like we often talk about.
Yeah, and what's interesting too is I think there's a lot of untapped development for a lot of players, and it's for this reason. The other cool thing about working with the NHLers that came to our practices was, like I mentioned, they were super generous with their time and with like coaching and sharing feedback. But what I also learned was their limitations of their own ability. They didn't know there was some things where they gave some just amazing feedback. One thing in particular was, I remember Dan Hamhuis, he'd make passes so quick at the blue line. And I was like, how do you do that? And he's like, you got to make sure to like look ahead before you receive the pass. And I was like, wait a second, you do that on every pass? This was a huge eye opener for me. And he was like, yeah, of course. Like, you got to always know your pass ahead of time. And I was just like, wow, like amazing. So that was amazing coaching, amazing advice. You just wouldn't learn that any other way. But I remember there was this one time one of the Sedins did some sort of cool pass and just did something. One of those things that I didn't understand. And I was like, I think it was Daniel. And I said, hey, like, did you mean to do that? And he was like, no. And I said, what did you do there? And he said, I don't fully know. And I was like, huh, like, so their talent is operating, and this is the way where you want to get your talent to, is you want it operating unconsciously. You actually don't want to be thinking about every movement as you're doing it, and they were there. So that's what makes it hard for these really amazing players to then coach the next generation, because they don't fully know what they're doing. And that's the way you want it. You want them to be unconscious about their skill, because to perform the skill, you need to be unconscious about it. But that's no good for teaching.
No. And I mean, to your point that you kind of stress here is when you're working on mechanics, you have to separate it from in-game, because in-game there's way too much going on. You can never in a million years think about, what you're doing mechanically, and that's where it has to be unconscious. Certain mechanics till, getting enough reps until they become second nature and automatic in a game when you need them to show up most.
Yeah, and there's this one concept I like, which I call it the smile of knowing, which is, because you brought up something earlier in our chat, which is, you don't know how many times you need to practice an anchor in practice until it shows up naturally in a game. Well, the thing is if you rep it so many times that it just like is so boring and like default, and I'm talking like thousands of reps, it will happen for you in a game. There's just no doubt. You just have to overwhelm the reps with number. Like, you just have to do way more reps than seems reasonable. And when you do that, it will happen in a game. And then you have the smile of knowing, because you're like, I put the work in, I did that. It goes like to Sid with the blisters on his hands that you're talking about. But like I said earlier, most players will never have that 0 to 1 moment that'll unlock a certain movement. And then they'll never have the opportunity to put in the reps on it, because they'll just never do that movement. They'll always avoid that movement when they're creating a movement strategy. Right. So that's like they'll have some sort of workaround to get where they want to go that doesn't include that more efficient mechanic.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And then it's kind of a missing tool. Like, that mechanic is just missing.
It's a missing tool. Absolutely. Yeah. It's just the worst. Like, I've been getting more into, I built a sauna, and that was fun, a lot of work. But yeah, like there'd be a time where you'd be like, okay, I need to like do this job, but I don't have the tool. I just can't do this thing until I have this tool. So like, there's no other choice. I got to go to Home Depot and get the tool. The issue is that a lot of players, when they say like I don't have the tool, they don't know that there's a Home Depot around the corner and they can just go acquire the tool. But there is that Home Depot. So what they do is they just stop building the sauna. They just let it sit there, and they're like, yeah, that's the sauna. It doesn't really need insulation or a roof, because I don't have the tool for the roof. So we'll just kind of leave it like that. That's a lot of players' game and mindset and mentality. But it doesn't need to be that way. I think like you brought up like tennis and golf. I think basketball is pretty good at this. Soccer is pretty good at this, which is like these sports, they actually look at it. It's like, well, you can acquire the different mechanics. Like, there's this mechanic and you can acquire it. Like, if you want to work on your topspin, there are these things to do for that. For tennis, I don't know basketball that well, but like soccer, it's like, if you want to know how to do a step over, like, you just do this. And in hockey, a lot of people look at McDavid and they go, can't teach that, right? It goes back to your magic component. And people always, you give me a hard time on this too, the magic mechanics that I talk about. Like my idea behind magic mechanics wasn't that there's literally magic, right? It was kind of a play, which is that the what do they say? It's like any sufficiently advanced technology looks like magic, right? And so if you imagine someone like 100 years ago and you showed them an iPad, they'd be like, this is magic. But it's not magic. It's actually just a really advanced technology. And so that's what like McDavid is like he's got really good technique and really great mechanics, but just it's hard. People don't comprehend it yet, right? And they will, people will, but at the moment, there's some people that look at it and they're like, that's magic, can't be taught. And there's others that are like, let's break that down.
Right. So just going back to, how that ties in with, kind of missing tools or missing mechanics essentially on a lot of people's skating or their games. There's also that degree of like, hey, when you can add a different mechanic, you're going to have that much more, probability of having success in game. And then I don't know, what else would you say is on that scale? So like there's a mechanic, it's either there or it's missing. There's also then, I guess, starting to incorporate the mechanics, but only being able to do it at 20% speed or comfort or 30% comfort, right? So then they're also kind of avoided. But like, I'm sure there's some sort of graph then that would be trending up for your comfort level on a lot of the mechanics that you maybe can do, just not yet in game.
Yeah, like, well, I think the what you're saying, like someone who's like able to do the mechanics, like period, but they're just
Right.
not 100% comfortable with it.
Yeah. So you were like, there's 0 to 1
Yeah,
for all the then that get to 1, but then their 1 is like 20% of out of 100 of being able to do the mechanic, right? And I think that's where a lot of players are that are inside Train 2.0, or a lot of the members. There's a certain percentage of comfort and what speed they can do them at,
yeah.
as opposed to being 100%. Somebody like McDavid then would be 100% on every mechanic, right? He's kind of setting the standard. Yeah, a lot of
Well,
the
you have these opposing forces that work against each other, and there's like a psychology, there's a safety, there's a social psychology, and then there's physics, right? So McDavid is mastering physics, which is just like these are like immutable laws. Like he's just maximizing his body's physics, like literally his maximized physics. But then on the other side of it, or how you maximize physics, is you really have to use gravity and centripetal force for a lot of your movements versus pushing and like contracting your muscles. The challenge is that means you have to lean over a lot. And when you lean over a lot, that triggers fear. And when you have the fear response, you tighten up and you straighten up. And your first response is to improve your balance. And when I say improve your balance, I mean like straighten up and stop leaning. So you have on one hand that in order to be the most efficient mover as a skater, you need to lean and use gravity and constantly feel like you're in a state of falling. But in order to do that, you have to overcome a fear response. And a lot of players will never overcome that fear response. And that's okay if you are fine with just not maximizing your body's efficiency. And then where I say this, the social element comes in, there's what we talked about earlier. If they are in season and let's say they're in the AHL and wanting to crack the NHL, well, they're probably not going to take those risks to practice leaning and potentially falling in a practice or a game. We can go back to that, but like, and that's, I don't tend to recommend that people are doing wholesale updates of their mechanics in season. I tend to say that you want to do that off season unless you have like a progressive coach who's actually teaching this kind of thing. So in that case, when you have the ability and the space and the psychological safety in your group to fail, then you can push yourself. But now you're dealing with your own kind of psychology. Like so we're now out of the fear response, we're out of the social kind of response, but now there's just the overall feeling of like, do I want to get uncomfortable and potentially fall and do something weird, and do something that's foreign to my body and different. So if you can overcome those three things and then just put in the reps, you will get there. That's just how it works. Like you do reps, you get better, but you have to overcome those three things first. And if you don't, you will never get there.
Cool. Yeah, no, that answers my question perfectly. I think that's something that a lot of the people listening to your podcast, they can really take home with them, right? It's kind of pushing past those barriers that we place on ourselves, and that in the whole realm of mechanics and going from 0 to 1 and then improving maybe what percentage you're at. It's interesting, and I don't think it's so widely adopted right now in the hockey world.
No, but this is a start. Sharing the story, sharing how this all came together. I think that's good for today. We left people with a lot. Let's end the game there.
Perfect. Thanks, Jason.